And it's still the easiest joke for a comedian to either jump into tights and, float around.
The idea that a man could be sensitive or be involved in anything that had sensitivity, it's played upon as a joke.
I guess because enough of them, number one, they wear tights and enough of them lisp to, make people want to comment on it.
For some, there's nothing funnier than a man practicing this distinctly feminine art form. But the real punchline is that ballet isn't a woman's art form at all. In fact, ballet was not only created by men, it was created for men. The male dancer. If not for his commitment, prowess, and vision, ballet as we know it today might not exist. Under the male dancer, ballet leapt from court entertainment to popular art form, achieved new dramatic heights, and found a permanent place in the hearts of audiences the world over. And what was the male dancer's reward for his enormous contribution? 100 years of ridicule. The fact is, men danced long before ballet came along. In fact, they didn't dance with female partners until the 12th century. Before that, men danced ritualistically in Egypt, ancient Greece, and Rome. The Spartans even took dance as part of military training.
That in basic military training, soldiers are put through drill in order to be able to carry themselves properly, to discipline the instrument that is their body. And in classical ballet and military training have that analogy. In both cases, it's to be able to discipline the body. And it obviously has different objectives. Very much fewer corpses lie on the ballroom floor than do on the battlefield. But nonetheless, this is what it's about.
Even ballet, long considered a feminine art form, is the brainchild of the male sex.
It was rather a strange evolution, I think. It was started by men and in the court, but ballet as we know it in its beginnings, they rather got pushed to the sidelines or the background.
This is the birthplace of ballet's first male star. Now, most of the world's great male dancers, from Nijinsky to Nureyev, were born in poverty. Most, but not all. The exception was Louis XIV, the central character in the story of the male ballet dancer. The story opens at the Palace of Versailles, where a grand celebration is taking place. The king, Louis XIV, encourages all of his male courtiers to dance. He even performs a solo himself as the Sun King. Women, meanwhile, are reminded that throwing oneself about with physical abandon is unladylike, and they are fitted with restrictive costumes. The second act takes place in the world's first dance school, where, at King Louis's behest, ballet grows from court entertainment to academic practice. Primo ballerinos include Pierre Beauchamp, who defines the 5 basic positions of the feet, ballet's technical building blocks. Jean Ballon, the great dancer and innovator whose practice of leaping is today named after him, and Jean-Georges Noverre, who develops plausible plot lines and emphasizes a more realistic style of acting. But as in all great romantic ballets, misfortune visits the male dancer in the form of a light and lyrical creature, the ballerina. The male dancer falls from grace and all but dies. But in the joyous third act, he is rescued by a group of handsome heroes and restored to his former glory. Let's talk about that second act and the famous fall from grace that reduced opinion of the male dancer from this.
Men in ballet, I think it's wonderful. I love to watch them.
Well, those guys are amazing. They do things our greatest athletes couldn't do.
To this.
Male dancers? I haven't dated any, that's for sure.
Oh, those guys, I think some of those guys are pretty light in their loafers.
Interesting use of words, because the reason for the male dancer's downfall was this. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, Europe rebelled against traditional forms. Artists and audiences alike looked to something that transcended the squalor and anonymity of their age. Art focused on beauty, fragility, and idealism. What better personification of these ideals than the female form? And what better tool to elongate and extenuate that form than the point shoe?
All through the 19th century, we needed to float. The ideal was woman, floating on a tiny toe tip, leaving the ground, hiding the effort.
With the advent of the point shoe, ballet was now entirely centered on the ballerina. Try as he might, the male dancer could not come up with a comparable feat. He even tried to dance on point himself. Another part of the costume the male dancer appropriated from the ballerina proved to be more than a facile plea for equal stage time. Eventually, tights would become the male dance costume of choice and would help to reintroduce audiences to the beauty of the male form. But for many years before that, tights would hang around the male dancer's neck like a noose.
When I joined the National Ballet, would kind of say, aren't you embarrassed wearing tights?
The ballet costume is very functional, and it's to enable freedom of movement, and it's also to enable us to appreciate the line of the body. And if tights happen to facilitate that, which they do, why not wear tights? I mean, if you want to wear baggy pants doing an arabesque, it's not going to look very effective. So this is the reason why those costumes and those steps happen to work very well together. And now if people are worried that that makes men look effeminate, you can't deal with that. It's in the eye of the beholder. I remember once a talk that Edward Villela gave at the Spoleto Festival in Charleston, in which they asked what it was like to grow up in Queens studying ballet. And he said, well...
Not too many guys in Queens were wearing tights.
And it's true. He didn't have a supportive environment, but in fact, he was wearing the costume that he had to dance the steps that he was dancing.
And for those of you who are wondering what it is we wear under our tights, and I know you're out there, it's this, an undergarment known as a dance belt, which helps to define the body in an aesthetically pleasing way. How's that for getting around the censors? Well, what is the importance or significance of a dance belt?
Well, I think we'd sell more tickets if they weren't worn.
But tights, belts, hats, shoes, capes, no accessories could steal focus from the ballerina. So for the next 100 years or so, the male dancer contented himself with raising the function of the porteur to a high art.
And I think for female dancers, the biggest difficulty is that we are the one out in front, and we actually have the easier job in the sense that we have to create the flow of movement. We have to create the shape of the movement. And our male partner behind us has to facilitate that movement and work along with us without hampering our ability to move. So it becomes a very high-skilled thing.
Aided by her porteur, the ballerina could now claim the entire art for herself. Ballet had become a distinctly feminine art form. Even into the first half of the 20th century, male participation in ballet would be the result of accident rather than design. And those who braved the stigma of effeminacy would pay a considerable price.
Whenever you ask a man how he got started dancing, it was always some convoluted way, some accident that happened, usually anyway. It was like he went to ballet class with his sister, was sitting there, and somebody dragged him in, or something like that.
I got hit by a baseball, knocked unconscious while I was hanging out in the streets, while my sister was away at a local school. And when my mother found out I was brought home unconscious and she wasn't there, she dragged me to my sister's school. And I couldn't sit there and watch 40 giggling girls without having some kind of response physically. And so I waited until they started to jump. I went in the back of the room, started to jump, and I started to make fun of it, disrupted the class, and the teacher gave me a dirty look and said to my mother, "You either get him out of here or stick him in tights at the bar." So the next day, there I was in tights at the bar.
I heard so many male dancers say how they were, had to fight their way. They always were getting into fights and defending themselves.
In my school days, these are just examples, when some of us who weren't boarders would go to the tube stations to go home, and there were all schools converging, and our children talk and shout at each other, whatever, and, what school do you come from? No one ever really said the Royal Ballet School. We weren't fools.
Most of my time with my friends, I was proving that I was as virile or more virile. Fortunately for me, being very, very physical, very, very fast, and with the ballet training, I was that much quicker and stronger than anybody else, so I didn't stand for too much.
It's kind of interesting that at that time, though, if you had been on the stage as a hoofer, you were accepted, but if you were on the stage as a ballet dancer, different story.
You have to remember that in North America, men began dancing usually in their middle to late teens. And many of the men that chose to dance at that period were gay men. It was an area they thought they could be safe in. That has changed enormously in the last 30 or 40 years when we are now choosing 8-year-olds to be in our ballet, to begin training, and the percentage of gay men in ballet has reduced enormously. And I think it was about men being afraid of going to this art form that had gay men in it. It frightened them. What if people may think if I go to see this, that this interests me, so I will not go. This is a feminine art form. Now, the other reason I believe that's true is the compensation involved. So why are men going into something where men cannot make a living, which was true in the 40s and when I started dancing in the 50s. So you had to be sort of careful. You have suspect motives, and you have a large percentage of gay people in this. It's something to be suspect about.
Whatever form this reproach and harassment may have taken in 1836, it hardly bothered one dancer, Auguste Bournonville, the man who would start the revolution that would reinstate the male dancer. That year, this Danish dancer-choreographer saw a production, La Sylphide, at the time a vehicle for the great ballerina Marie Taglioni. Bournonville returned home and restaged it, with the emphasis on the male lead. In Paris, then the center of world culture, the male dancer was dead. But in Denmark, thanks to Bournonville, he was alive and kicking.
I think Mr. Bournonville's own ego helped us produce those male dancers. He very much wanted to showcase his own dancing, even when he was director of the Royal Danish Ballet. And if you will notice in a ballet he did for himself and his star female pupil, Lucille Grand, called La Sylphide, the Sylph, all of his variations have very clear endings. All of her, everything she does trails off, does not complete, and he starts dancing in the middle of it. This is so that he will have applause and she will not. Very calculated.
Then, in 1909, an event occurred which would once again reverse the male dancer's fortunes and restore him to his early glory. That year in Paris, the curtain rose on a talent so formidable that even today people speak of him in mythic terms. His name, Václav Nijinsky. Unlike Louis XIV, Nijinsky was born into poverty in 1888. After his father left the family, Václav's mother placed him in Russia's premier dance academy, the Imperial Ballet School of St. Petersburg. Nijinsky's instructors were schooled in the style of August Bournonville. They groomed young Václav for stardom. In his teens, Nijinsky began appearing in productions by the Mariinsky Theater, where he came under the influence of choreographer Michel Fokine. Together, under the subsidy of impresario Serge Diaghilev, Nijinsky and Fokine would dethrone the ballerina from the world stage.
You hear about the fabulous leaps and the way he would stay in the air as they sit. And you can almost picture it. And then you see how through the years and the tradition, development, and how technically really the male dancer technique has developed enormously through the many years. And you see someone like Nureyev perform Spectre Rose many, many years later. And you see a Soloviev, for example, perform it also too, and you say, wow, can it actually have been that good already then? And can it actually get better than that? That's what's so beautiful and amazing.
When Diaghilev first imported Nijinsky to the West, the French were driven wild by this virtuoso display of Russian male dancing. As a result, Western audiences developed an insatiable appetite for Soviet male dancers. Over the coming years, Russian companies, each with their male stars, began to tour the West on a regular basis. But by the middle of the century, wanting to sustain this broader acclaim and seeking greater freedom of expression, Russian dancers began to defect. For one particular dancer, this precarious act came easy. After all, rebellion had always been a part of his fiery, individualistic character. So at an airport outside of Paris, in 1961, the greatest male dancer since Václav Nijinsky declared himself a free agent.
Everyone was very ready to perhaps put the mantle of Nijinsky on another living being. And he came with this enormous sort of furor of a Russian defecting. So it was self-made mass media publicity. But of course, he had the great, enormous, charismatic talent to back it up.
Dance was popular within the world of dance. Everyone knew who Nijinsky was in the world of dance. Nureyev took it one step further. He brought ballet to mass public like the Beatles did. He brought it to a world that never knew about what dance was all about.
Unlike the androgynous Nijinsky, Rudolf Nureyev would bring to ballet the very quality that exempted men from it in the first place: animalism.
It was like an animal, flailing nostrils and marvelous tarted cheekbones, and the passion and the power and the quietness as he leapt and he stole onto the stage.
I really saw tiger on stage. I saw lion on stage. I saw huge, big animal on stage.
1962 would be a milestone year for Nureyev. He would be paired with Margot Fonteyn to form the most famous dance partnership of our time.
And she was very wary at being at her stage in her career, and this young tiger that had jumped into the midst.
He was wild and crazy. He wanted it absolutely right. And then you have Margot, whose musicality was absolutely impeccable. And so therefore, if you look at them, they weren't that much different. On the outside, perhaps, but inwardly their desire to find this absolute purity and cleanliness and simplicity was the same. So it was really a wonderful match.
Thanks to the showmanship and iconoclasm of Nijinsky and Nureyev, dance history has been rewritten. In their wake, most of the full-length classics originally developed for the ballerina have been restaged to include solos, variations, and psychological depth for the male roles.
Originally, Sleeping Beauty, the male dancer did not have a solo in the third act. He had a coda. The second little solo, he had a coda. He did not have the main big solo that was later installed years later. Originally, in La Bayadere, the male dancer did not have a solo in the second act in the Kingdom of the Shades. His big solo came inside the palace, one act before. Today, when they perform just the Kingdom of the Shades, they have his big solo from the palace with the big coda of the Kingdom of the Shades.
Further, a number of male dancers have gone on to command handsome salaries, and participation amongst the young is at an all-time high.
I think now they're almost reigning supreme in a way, because one hears around the world that there's more talent in schools amongst the boys than there tends to be amongst the girls. And I know a lot of directors believe it's the time of men.
And as for the stigma?
As far as the stigma goes, I do think that the stigma of effeminacy from a male dancer, I think that is just about a thing of the past.
There's no question that there has been a far greater acceptance of what we do generally, but more specifically what our male dancers do. A far greater acceptance now than there ever has been.
From the days of Louis XIV through to the artistry and acclaim of Nijinsky and Nureyev, the male dancer has come full circle.
It's incredibly gratifying and rewarding. I mean, you know, how many guys go off and learn to play instruments or in a rock band or take the musical side of that spiritual fulfillment? And then on the other side, they will do the physical, the sports side of that fulfillment. Well, this is both in one.
Imagine you're a young dancer. Imagine that you've been invited to a gala evening to dance the greatest moments from the classic ballets. Imagine yourself dancing these great works in front of a full house in the company of some of the greatest dancers in the world, heroes long admired. Imagine the electricity. Imagine the chemistry. Imagine the poignancy. And when all is said and done, imagine you and your fellow performers basking in the applause. And as you take a bow, imagine yourself thinking, God, I hate these things. Every ballet has its memorable moments. The Black Swan pas de deux in Swan Lake, the Rose Adage in The Sleeping Beauty, the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. Audiences enjoy these moments so much that they're often performed separately, the same way that a hit show tune is often performed outside the musical it's from. These excerpts are usually performed at galas, which are black tie fundraisers for dance companies or charity.
It's the same as you'd have in an athletic contest. I mean, there are certain climaxes in the bullfight and on the cricket pitch and so on. Certain things that stand out, moments that are great, worth celebrating. So you carve them out of the ballet and present them as a smorgasbord.
For an audience, attending a gala is twice as pleasurable as attending a ballet. Firstly, it's an evening composed exclusively of highlights. And second, galas are a great format for a dance company or group of dance companies to show off their best dancers.
The gala needs to be that. It needs to be one extraordinary dancer after another coming out at their absolute optimum best.
Ironically, for the dancer, it's these same reasons, the volume of stars and the nature of the dance pieces, that limit the gala's appeal.
Whenever you go to a gala, the biggest problem is that, first of all, as compared to being one of, say, 5 or 6 principal dancers in your own company, you're there in a whole company of all principal dancers, and therefore all requiring the same amount of time, the same amount of preparation time, of stage time, of recognition, of whatever, of publicity, of this, of that. And you realize that when you go to a gala, you're not going to get the extra time. You're going to get your 10 minutes to prepare, or whatever, and that's all.
Despite the fact that one felt that it was number one, a performance opportunity, and number 2, either for a good cause or whatever, there was always an element of competition about it.
It's the circus. It's the queen. We will see who is the one to turn the best, who is the one to fall. That's it, a bit.
I think it was also taking what were technically difficult and challenging things out of context. I mean, getting up to do Black Swan when you hadn't done the white act, and it was just so, I think, just very difficult. I used to find it horrible.
You lose the context in which the dance first appeared. Now, if it's a dance that's purpose is simply to show off in a very civilized manner, I grant, then that's fine. But when there's a narrative understanding that you should have of where that fits into the ballet, then I'm sort of sorry to lose that in a gala, because you are just having things yanked out of context.
There's little artistic directors can do about the atmosphere of one-upmanship at a gala. But they usually resolve the dancer's dilemma with the material by mixing in a number of short, abstract ballets. Inevitably, these mood pieces are the hit of the evening. A perfect example of one of these works is a short solo developed by choreographer Michel Fokine. Though Fokine was at the cutting edge of dance, he devised this piece as a throwback to the age of the white ballets. Reconstructing a period style, Fokine developed a poetic piece for a childhood friend about a bird in the throes of death. The piece was The Dying Swan, and the friend, the incomparable Anna Pavlova. Her style was never controversial, her technique a little heavy-handed, but nevertheless, Anna Pavlova did more to popularize ballet than any other figure. She toured the world with her own company from 1911 until her death in 1931, leaving indelible memories with thousands who had never before seen ballet.
She went through the whole world. Never mind how small was the city where she was always bringing ballet and bringing her name equally to everybody.
The Dying Swan was her signature piece. Its rich technical and emotional demands suggest what an absolute master Pavlova must have been.
I suppose it's something that you need to perform many times to really find your own unique way of doing it, you know, because it's so associated with Maya Plisetskaya and Pavlova. You know, everyone sort of has an image of how they would imagine it being done, and it's hard, even in our own minds, to break through that and find your own way of expressing yourself in a piece like that.
Not an easy act to follow. Which brings up an important question. When you have so many great short pieces and excerpts, how do you decide in which order to present them?
It's a bigger challenge than it is to put a full-length ballet on, theatrically, and give the audience a good experience. I mean, one either has to put them together thematically, or to outright say, boast and say, this is how versatile these dancers are, and do, a contemporary piece, a tutu piece, and a theater piece, but they're difficult to put together.
They tend to have a certain sameness to them because the pas de deux form, the duet form in ballet, is we dance together, we each dance alone, and we dance together again. Now, if you've seen that 3 or 4 times, or 5 or 6 times, wherein dancers have taken the material and sculpted it on themselves and done their best steps, they tend to all then look the same. And after 4 or 5 of these, so one has to craft the evening in a way that keeps them separate and try to do things that are very different from each other, not things that tend to look alike.
A piece that is a mainstay of many a gala is Le Corsaire, a dazzling display of leaps, turns, and spinning jumps.
When it's danced at its very best, Le Corsaire, it collects all of those aspects of dance all in one wonderful little package, and that is athleticism and zest and courage and musicality and joy and exuberance and artistry. And it literally can knock the roof off a theater and lift people to their feet.
From Le Corsaire, we move to a piece that recalls the great age of the Romantic ballets. However, unlike his Dying Swan, Fokines Les Sylphides, set to the music of Frédéric Chopin, features no real characters and is free of any idle pyrotechnics.
If approached in that spirit, in the spirit of it not being an old classical ballet, the white tutus, almost a cliche, but understanding that it came from a new spirit and a new exploration, and that in fact Fokine was influenced by Isadora Duncan when he choreographed Les Sylphides in its almost impressionistic approach. It can be really one of the most exquisite ballets to dance.
If ballet has a golden age, it may well be the time of Marius Petipa, the great choreographer who, between 1847 and 1903, developed some 60 full-length ballets. In the last days of Russia's imperial theater, Petipa devised a piece in the Tchaikovskyan tradition of his heyday. Though Petipa was then in his 80s, he hadn't lost his touch. In fact, Raimonda is so full of choice moments, artistic directors have a hard time deciding which one to perform at a gala. If Petipa had a flaw, it was his almost total disregard for the male dancer. In fact, when choreographing, Petipa often left whatever little solos the male dancer had to his assistant. One of them, Lev Ivanov, thought enough of the danseur noble to develop this gala circuit favorite, the Bluebird, from Petipa's The Sleeping Beauty. The old showbiz dictum, always leave them wanting more, is perhaps truer in the gala dance evening than it is anywhere else. What better way to wrap up then than with the flash and fire of the most spirited moment in all of ballet, the grand pas de deux from Don Quixote. pretty solid lineup. But stringing together a medley of ballet's greatest hits isn't enough to lure an audience to a gala. There has to be stars, performers with that magical quality no one seems to be able to explain.
Well, you don't choose stars. They make themselves. There's no one teacher or a group of teachers, directors, can actually make a star. You're born with it. I mean, nobody can make a Karen Kane. You can train her physically, you can give her all the, you can give her images, you know, you can tell her little stories to help interpretation. But if that dancer hasn't got it inside, if she's not born with it, or he is not born with that indefinable something, then nobody can do it. I mean, I guess God could do it, but I couldn't.
So there's many, many different elements, but I think the final thing that makes you a star is the public and the way that they relate to you, the way that you communicate with them, the way that they see you, the fact that they recognize something in you that is unique.
So, if the public is the one definable element that goes into making a star, then it goes without saying that dancers have to give them what they want. And that means appearing in galas.
But I understand the necessity for those things. You've got to be flashy and glitzy, especially when you are performing for a so-called gala audience. There are audiences that respect and love and have knowledge of your repertoire and manner and style, and there are audiences who will come only to a gala, and those are very important audiences because they support you.
And hey, it's not all bad.
I think it's a great experience when you have a gala and you go there and you see every company, you know, you see a couple from London, a couple from the English National Ballet and Royal, and then you see the Kira and the Bolshoi, and they're all beautiful, but they're completely different. And they all have their own way, and every dancer have their own way. I think that's a great experience because it's not that one is better than the other, but they're different. That's what ballet's all about.
To wit, one can successfully argue that galas are responsible for developing a new breed of performer, the universal dancer.
There's a Russian, there's a Vaganova method, there is an Italian method, Cicchetti, and there is a Royal Academy of Dancing, which is an English method. But the wonderful thing about the evolution of our art is that these methods are gradually coming together. And it is now absolutely possible for a Canadian or an American dancer to go and join the Bolshoi Ballet and fit in very well, thank you very much, or vice versa. You can have little mannerisms of style which are different. I mean, it's possible that the French style will use a little more turned up wrist, a little more flowery use of the hands than, say, an English style which is rather simple and flat, plain. But those are very small details these days.
Very small indeed, like the concerns of the world's great dancers in comparison to the endless pleasure they bring to the public every time they put their remarkable talents on display at a gala evening.